Okay, good afternoon. I think we'll probably get a handful more people. But rest assured, you picked the best session of the day, the most exciting one to listen to, so hopefully you have lots of good questions as we get going. My name is Tom Davis. I'm currently a Vice President of Crown Consulting Incorporated, based out of Washington, D.C., but I live here in North Carolina. We do a lot of research and supporting work for the FAA and NASA in particular. I've only been doing this a couple of years. My career before then was 36 years at NASA, where I was a researcher in advanced air traffic management automation and eventually in UAS or drone operations and automation. Before I retired, I actually moved here first before I retired. Spent a couple of years here still working for NASA, but then retired. We have a great panel here today. We have quite a diversity and perspectives and viewpoints. I'll introduce them each individually in a few minutes, and then let them say a few words about themselves. But we have people here, we have somebody here from the medical sector, and you think, why is the medical sector here? We're going to find out there's some really cool stuff happening. We have a technologist from one of the leading companies in the nation that is providing UAS or drone or enabling drone capabilities and drone services. And then we have somebody here from the Asheville Regional Airport to give us not just a drone perspective, but also a perspective on how the air traffic system works in general. It's a really exciting time in aviation. Some people have said it's the most exciting and transformative time since the introduction of the jet engine into air transport. And you might say, why is that? Well, because there's lots of really good stuff happening on a local level and a national level, but how to move goods and services around a local urban area or urban to rural by drone. But also, if you've been reading the internet or the newspaper, you know that Uber is talking about moving people around. Probably most of you aren't as old as me, but when I was a kid, I watched a cartoon on Saturday morning called the Jetsons, and I think this is the future that Uber imagines, but they're not alone. There's a lot of others doing that. On the airport side or air traffic side, I think this is a little known thing, but I know a lot about it because we were working on it when I was still at NASA. Probably the most advanced air traffic management system in the world is currently being tested at Charlotte Douglas Airport. This is a system that allows collaboration between the airlines, in particular American Airlines, and the FAA in moving aircraft back from the gate on time or at a time in which they best fit in the taxiways and eventually into the en route stream as they head off to California or New York or wherever they're going. Super advanced system. Airlines are used to collaborating with the FAA on sort of an hourly basis. This brings it down to a minute by minute basis. And so all those times you may have taken off from Charlotte where you were waiting at the end of the runway for 15 minutes to take off, that time's going to probably start getting squeezed down to half or less than half of that here pretty soon. Pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of other things happening here in North Carolina. The NCDOT, as well as some of our panel members, are part of what's called the FAA's UAS or Drone IPP Integration Pilot Program, where we are one of 10, North Carolina is one of 10 entities across the country that are developing and testing very advanced use cases for drone use. In the case of North Carolina, we're looking at medical package delivery, as well as food package delivery, as well as infrastructure inspection, and that arose out of a really robust response to Hurricane Florence that we had here. And I'll embarrass him, but I saw Mr. Basil Yap just walk into the room. He heads a program at NCDOT that put itself together over the last 3 or 4 years with his leadership and Bobby Walston's leadership, who heads the Division of Aviation. In a matter of days, they put a team together to respond to Hurricane Florence and got drones in the air to take pictures and take video. And it's not just about getting on the front page of the Washington Post. It was actually about identifying alternative routes in and out of the coastal regions, moving assets around the state to respond in the best way possible. So that's happening here in the state right now. As we talk, it's some of the most advanced UAS or drone operations in the country. And then I already mentioned Uber. The Jetsons is coming. There's a lot of companies out there talking about moving people around urban areas or urban to rural in these maybe even pilotless vehicles eventually. In part, there are people even in the aviation world that look at that and say, no, that's not going to happen. That's not in my lifetime. But we recently attended a conference that NASA held in which they're issuing a grand challenge across the industry to try to prove these concepts. And 47 different aircraft manufacturing companies showed up. So that tells you people are actually building these vehicles and starting to think about how to actually fly them. So that kind of sets the stage for what we want to talk about today. The Wright brothers began flight here 115 years ago. It took 66 years to get to jets. I think it's going to be a lot faster to get to these types of vehicles that I just mentioned. So it's a really super exciting time. I think over the next 10 years in particular, it's going to really see things accelerate. So I now want to turn to the panel and let them talk a little bit about themselves. First here, just to my right, is Tina Kinsey. Tina is the Director of Marketing and Public Relations and Air Service Development at the Asheville Regional Airport. So Tina, could you talk a little bit about your background?
Well, great, thank you. I am so glad to be here today. Drove in this morning and always love to come to the big city from Asheville. I work at Asheville Regional Airport. I've been there 8.5 years, and I have over 20 years in marketing and business development. I focus my time on air service development, business development, really thinking about how a regional airport can serve the Western North Carolina region, grow with the region, look for innovative opportunities so that we can continue to really be what we need to be in the western part of the state. I also serve as the chair of the Airports Council International North America Marketing Steering Committee, and I am also the president of the North Carolina Airports Association, and I am delighted to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Collins. I'm the Vice President of Airspace Services at Precisionhawk. Briefly, Precisionhawk is a tech startup based right here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have about 150 employees. We've raised over $100 million in venture capital, really taking drones and applying them to industrial applications that really is going to affect all of our lives, whether we see it or not. Particularly using drones to inspect things like the electric utilities distribution systems and transmission lines, oil tanks, oil pads, insurance for after disasters, and all of these different applications that will work to improve ultimately everybody's quality of life, whether that's not having electricity go out or being able to get a home built faster after a hurricane. That's really our focus. My role at Precisionhawk, being a startup, changes every day. But what I really primarily have focused on over the past several years is our focus on research efforts to help us forward our ability to be able to do these types of applications. To be able to fly a transmission line, we have to fly hundreds of miles, so that requires lots of research. And so I led our program in conjunction with the FAA called the Pathfinder program, alongside with CNN and BNSF, to help conduct research on how can we effectively and safely integrate drones and be able to fly them very long distances in the same airspace that we're flying manned aircraft. Along with that, working with teams to develop various technologies for the management of airspace in a very automated way, and then working to productize that and commercialize that with various teams within the company. My background is traditionally is aviation as well. I went to school to be a pilot and somehow landed at flying planes that don't have pilots.
Hi, my name is Stuart Ginn. My day job is I'm a ear, nose, and throat or head and neck surgeon at WakeMed Health and Hospitals here in Raleigh. I'm also the medical director of WakeMed Innovations, which is our in-house innovations sort of system promoter and innovator and accelerator, looking at traditional innovation in healthcare systems. I'm a former airline pilot and flight instructor before I went back to medical school, so also a glutton for punishment and training, apparently. Among the other projects we're doing at WakeMed Innovations has been our involvement with the IPP that Tom mentioned before, our role at WakeMed, and so I'm leading the team to help integrate a medical package delivery network at WakeMed in partnership with the North Carolina DOT and our other partners, including Precisionhawk. We're really sort of, and I think we'll talk more about this in detail, but from a healthcare standpoint, it's become very clear to us. I was always sort of an apologist for this technology, but it's been very clear to us for several reasons that we'll probably discuss, that this kind of technology, and really more broadly technology around sort of emerging technologies in transport and mobility in healthcare, are really coming to the forefront of some of the innovations we're looking at. That's due to lots of changes in the healthcare system and the way things are designed and implemented in healthcare, but it's also because obviously of the acceleration in the technology itself. So we'll look forward to talking about that and talking about the projects we're doing at WakeMed.
Okay, as we get going, I want to encourage people from the audience to stand up and ask some questions, because this is really for you. But I did prepare, or we prepared a few questions that we thought might help get the conversation rolling. Before I get to those, I do want to mention there was one other person we had hoped to have here today, Michael O'Hara, who's the FAA administrator for the southern region of the United States. Unfortunately, because of the federal shutdown, which is all over the news, he could not be there. If there are questions related to the FAA, we will, as a panel, try to handle them. I personally have a fair amount of experience working with the FAA. While I would never try to speak for them, I might at least be able to give you a hint of what they're thinking or what they've done to address certain issues. And then Stuart, as an airline pilot, would have that viewpoint as well, from a little bit different perspective. But so the first question, we'll just sort of throw it out to all three of you. What is something happening in this industry or sector right now that you couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, and how do you think it's going to play out over maybe the next 5 years? Does anybody want to grab that one first?
My perspective might be a little bit different, or a little more basic at its core, of specifically drones. Prior to flying drones and flying manned aircraft, I can remember back to my childhood building and flying small remote controlled airplanes, which really kind of are the forthcoming of the drones. That they're small planes, they fly. These were gas powered and large and loud. Couldn't fly themselves, and so really, from my perspective, it's been incredible to see a shift in technology to be able to take something that traditionally, we were using to fly very large aircraft like airliners in a very automated way, be able to miniaturize that to the size that, it can fit on a single microchip that allows me to fly a drone extremely precisely in space to be able to collect the type of data that we need to collect. And so, looking at this, it's only happened over the past couple of years, and some of the factors driving that have actually not been, some of it has come out of DOD, but a lot of it's actually been driven by the consumer space. People wanting this technology for their own use, companies coming out of China that have really driven the use and development of technology that allows us to do these much more advanced types of applications for industrial use. And so really kind of going forward, I think it's now the compounding effect of that, of what other types of sensors can we put on the drone. From our perspective, when we're flying a drone, it's not just to go take pictures. We're using very complex sensors. In some cases, sensors that can detect gas leaks that we can't see with our naked eye. Sensors that use a laser to map the terrain. And to see what's going to be able to come next, people talk about ground-penetrating radar sensors, things that we haven't even heard of in some cases, or that may have been so large that we've never been able to imagine being able to fly them on such a small airplane. I really think the impact of that is going to be, compounding of what we're seeing even today, what we would call the infancy of the drone sector.
So my perspective is a little different. I'm focused on looking at air service connectivity, looking at North Carolina, Western North Carolina in particular. We are a regional airport. And we are an important region in North Carolina. And I think one of the things in my going on 9 years in this industry that I did not see coming 5 years ago is the significant jump growth in air service that is happening at regional airports, especially at Asheville Regional Airport. In fact, we are considered the best connected regional airport in the country right now. And a lot of that comes from many, many different things. But if we think about transportation and what we're here to talk about today, you know, we've seen advances in more efficient aircraft. We've seen the airlines being able to be profitable at a smaller regional airport, and combined with that, you know, the economy and the consumers and what they want and the number of times they travel, we've really seen the world shrink. We are so much more connected than we used to be, and it really is due to some advancements in aviation.
I think my perspective on this is actually a little bit unusual and specific and touches on the healthcare sector in particular, but stick with me. It absolutely does have a lot to do with transportation. If you ask a healthcare technologist and somebody who's interested in works in healthcare innovation, what surprises you, what did you anticipate? Well, healthcare innovation is surprisingly boring and predictable and very difficult. And the healthcare system in the United States is fragmented and very difficult to move the needle. Over the past, what surprises me, what I didn't anticipate 5 years ago when I first started working in healthcare, and in particular in innovation, is that the needle is starting to move on the kinds of technologies we're looking at to solve healthcare problems. What I mean is, and I'll give some examples. One example, for instance, is CVS just bought or is buying Aetna. So a retail pharmacy is buying a health insurer. That seems a little strange at first, except when you think about the healthcare landscape, what's changing is logistics. Like lots of industries that are sort of moving from a cottage industry into a real industry, a lot of the things that are needed to make that work and actually deliver care to patients on their own terms are not curing cancer, are not brand new technology off the bench. A lot of it is boring stuff on the back end, the laundry service. How do you move labs around your system? How do you move patients around your system and expertise, and how do you deliver those things to patients where they need them? It turns out that that's becoming a topic of interest to a lot of people. The reason retail pharmacies like CVS are interested in healthcare is because they're starting to deliver healthcare. There are already hubs for logistics in healthcare for actual patients. People need to show up at retail pharmacies to pick up their medications and all the other things they buy at pharmacies. Well, now they're asking for medical care there. MinuteClinics are integrating with Targets and CVS's and Walgreens. That's a really interesting change, and now it's being financed, basically. So from the transportation standpoint, it's becoming very important to healthcare systems to solve for transportation issues. You're also seeing this when you see companies like Lyft and Uber cut deals with healthcare systems to deliver their patients to their appointments, because transportation is a limitation for at least 3 or 4 million patients a year in this country. So those things are really surprising. I don't think if you talk to most people in healthcare 5 years ago, they would have said logistics is becoming an important part of what we do for innovation, but it's absolutely happening. And one final example would be the upcoming sort of healthcare venture that's been announced between Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan, and Amazon. So when you step back, and they basically announced they're going to create a company to redefine healthcare delivery in the United States, and that's an awfully auspicious goal. But when you step back and look at how they're doing that, they've essentially got a large insurance company, they've got a massive finance company, and they've got a massive logistics company. And the reason the three things are important are, I believe, tied around logistics. So transportation will play an increasingly important role in healthcare, we believe.
So if you'll bear with me, unless there's a quick question, I'm going to push back to you, Stuart.
Yes.
I've had a lot of lunchtime and breakfast or coffee, more coffee discussions with Stuart about how everything he said plays out, but would you mind spending a couple minutes describing what's happening right now with the IPP and weight med and drone delivery? Could you just kind of put some meat on the bones for that?
Sure. So the weight med role in the integration pilot program is essentially an end user, in that, basically, briefly, we would like to develop a network of drones to help us deliver small packages around our growing network of facilities. And we're starting with blood samples and labs, but we would like to keep that moving forward over time to include pharmaceuticals and small parcels. It turns out that our courier systems, which we use now, people in trucks, which are mostly outsourced, and that's not unique to us, it's a difficult business. It's not a very good business for a lot of those companies, and the service that's provided is often less than what we would like to do to achieve to pass on the appropriate care to our patients. Long turnaround times, long delivery times, and unfortunately in healthcare, a lot of times what you need and where you need it are unpredictable and different every day. So you need a system that is very fluid, very dynamic, and where additional deliveries don't tax the system too much in terms of time, reliability, or cost. So we look at unmanned aircraft, small unmanned aircraft, and even larger aircraft in the future as a way to potentially solve for that problem. So the goal with the IPP is to work with the partners and the NCDOT to try to implement a system like that as a prototype, and then solve for all those integration issues we're going to have on the ground at a healthcare system level.
So you're coming after this one, Tina, but so I'm going to push next to Tyler because Stuart talked about medical package delivery, which is part of an ongoing effort here in our state right now. I should point out that we have a pretty good insight into everything that's going on around the country related to drone use, and this is probably the most advanced use case out there right now. It's a complex case because you have to fly over people and across highways and things like that, but there's a lot of things you can do safety-wise to put in place. And so I want to now head to Tyler and say, could you outline some of the other use cases besides medical package delivery that you know about? And maybe, we're also not only lucky to have Weight Med and Stuart here kind of pushing this forward with NCDOT, we're also very lucky to have a company like Precisionhawk in our state. They're truly an industry leader. You cannot go to a national conference without them being featured speakers or being an important part of the conversation, and they're right here in Raleigh. So we're very lucky to have that. I want to give Tyler a chance to talk about the other kinds of things that are going, include, if you don't mind, include a little bit of discussion about what might be happening with the military. I think you guys are doing some stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Precisionhawk, we primarily focus on civil applications. We have done some work with public agencies, a very slight amount of work with DoD type organizations, but primarily focus on civil applications. And in fact, everybody calls us a drone company. We call ourselves a drone company, but at heart, we're really a remote sensing and analytics company. And what I mean by that is we are collecting data from a drone with its various sensors. It could be a camera, a thermal sensor, like I mentioned earlier, the methane gas detection type sensor, LiDAR. And we take that data, that raw data, and then we run it through various different artificial intelligence algorithms, different algorithms that we've developed to actually be able to extract valuable information out of that. So a great example of this, tying back into the electric utility example, is that today, electric utility companies have people drive around in trucks, look at all of the telephone poles, and just visually say, oh, that looks good, that transformer probably doesn't look good, maybe I see a broken insulator, oh, the trees are getting too close, we need to send somebody out to cut those. Well, what we found is that those people doing those by foot, although very low cost, fairly efficient, is fairly archaic in how that data is collected, processed, and managed, in the sense that they're using paper checklists. A lot of the information doesn't actually get seen, so a lot of the damage is actually missing. In fact, we're finding that A comparison of using drones to a person going out and doing a lot of these analytics is we're almost finding in some cases up to 5x the deficiencies on power electric utility poles that somebody on the ground would, which has a lot of downstream effects. So we're using the drones to collect the data. That data runs through artificial intelligence, machine learning, different types of algorithms, really looking for these problems. Do I have a transformer that's corroding? Do I have trees that are getting too close to the line, which is really important come hurricane season? Or if it's really dry in California, that can play a huge factor as well. And so we're analyzing this and providing back answers to these companies. And this is for electric utility, this is for the insurance companies, this is for the agriculture companies that we're working with, that they just need to know, where do I need to send somebody to cut a tree? And in most cases, we're not even sending the imagery that the drones are collecting back to these companies. They just need the answers. And that's why we call ourselves a remote sensing company, because at the end of the day, we're looking at things. The drone is our tool to be able to look at those things. In fact, we're using manned aircraft in some areas where drones don't make sense. We acquired a satellite imaging company several years ago so that we can use satellite imagery to see much larger areas than a drone can see. And then we specialize on getting those answers. So electric utility, like I mentioned, is one of our largest industries that we focus in. We see one of the biggest impacts there. The downstream impact of that is by having better maintenance. We have less power outages, especially during hurricanes when poles have to be rated to withstand so much wind. We're helping a utility in Florida actually do the calculations of, with everything on this pole, how much wind can this pole actually handle before it breaks? And because of that, we can help them do these hardening programs. Insurance is a very interesting application for us as well. And you ask insurance, what do insurers want with drones? Well, a lot of it actually comes with property casualty post-disaster. So prior to a disaster, we'll use satellite data, manned aircraft imagery, some drone data to understand what's there today, what's already built today. I know that I have a house, this is what it looks like. Without any damage, this is what this house looks like. After a storm, the insurers need to understand how much damage has occurred to that house. Is it 50% damage? Is it a total loss? Ultimately, so they can take actions to get information back to their customers and checks back to their customers to repair that house. In fact, one of our largest customers in the space is USAA, very large company that is very customer forward. They want their customers to have the best experience. And so really where this comes to play is after a hurricane, they would have to wait until one, it was safe enough to send their adjusters in by foot to go look at house by house by house, which was very time consuming. Whereas with a drone, we can fly over an entire neighborhood within a couple of hours, be able to classify and calculate the damage to every house in that neighborhood, and then feed that back into these insurance companies. And why that's important to be that fast and that efficient is we found out that within a 48-hour time span after a hurricane, the hour that the hurricane's passed and the recovery effort starts, a 48-hour difference in getting a check into a customer's hands can mean up to 6 months or more in actually getting contractors scheduled to do repairs to that house. So that's why it's so important that we can get data very fast, effectively, but also very consistently accurate. And then of course agriculture, I think when people hear drones, agriculture is kind of we're using drones for agriculture. Definitely a very large application there, but less in the US. The US by far will be a large user of drones for agriculture, but what we found is in the US, our farms are highly optimized already from production outputs through things like GMOs, through different methodologies of how we farm, but where we see massive applications for using drones in agriculture is in developing countries where we can help them get to higher optimizations of crop growth and production. And so we're looking at all of these different areas. We have teams of analysts internally that help develop out these applications, but again, at the end of the day, we look at the drone as a tool that we are now sharing the same airspace with airline pilots, for example. And that's why we're so interested in engaging in things like the IPP, the FAA programs, because we need to make sure that we can get our data collection platforms in the air in the safest way possible to collect that data to make these differences in these different industries. So that's really kind of our perspective. I think the applications are really endless. I hear a new one every day. People now are asking, well, can we count cars in a parking lot? We lose cars in our auction parking lots. We need to be able to count cars and find cars. And so the applications are endless. You can use a drone for almost anything, but these are just some of the ones that we've seen success in these various industries.
Okay, it's going to be your turn after this one. So get your questions ready. I want to go to Tina now. We've talked a lot about drones and sort of the Jetson stuff, but they're no less important are the people of Asheville, for example, and how we connect to some of our regional airports and how we maintain a high level of service to those places. I learned something maybe like you today, that it's the most connected regional airport in the country. I can see why. I love to visit there. My wife and I go there several times a year, and we're going to go in 2 more weeks. I was mentioning to her earlier. So, Tina, I'd like to ask if you could talk about some of the biggest challenges and things coming towards regional air travel, and what maybe the government or the state can do to help solve some of the challenges and the problems.
Okay, before I answer, I need to have an idea of who all of you are. Who in here is in aviation? So just a small number of people. So the rest of you are in some other area of transportation in the state of North Carolina. Okay, so how many of you have been to Asheville? Okay, all right. So Asheville, we're way over on the other side of the state, up the mountains, and you know, our airport is the 4th largest commercial service airport in the state of North Carolina. To give you perspective, we have 72 public airports in North Carolina, 10 commercial service airports. Okay, and so we are the 4th largest in terms of numbers of passengers who are served. But when we think about connectivity, there are so many things. As you know, as transportation professionals, we're all about connectivity, moving people, goods, and services, connecting communities, connecting our state to the global economy, to the world. And so we need to find ways to do that really work. And some of the challenges that a regional airport has, and I'm just going to use Asheville as the example because that's the one that I know. We have grown significantly in the last 5 years, and in just 5 years we've grown by 62% in terms of the number of passengers that we're serving. That's huge. That's huge growth. But with that come a lot of logistics. We have 6 airlines that serve the airport. They come with airplanes. The airplanes have to go somewhere. And so we need parking spaces for those airplanes. All the people who fill those airplanes come to the airport, and we have to have space for them logistically. We have all kinds of rules about, and I'm sure all of you in the transportation industry understand this, as public airport, there are some things we can use public funds for. There are other projects we can't use public funds for, but that does not mean that our challenges, our infrastructure challenges go away. And I would say that in aviation in our state, infrastructure is a big challenge. I think that's a national challenge for airports and aviation. It's so expensive to keep up, to keep your airport where it needs to be now and then also moving into the future. We have had to build a new runway. That's a big project. That's a lot of money. We had to build a parking garage. We could not use aeronautical funding for that. Big challenge. And so we work hard at educating members of our community, our elected officials, but also working collaboratively with airport leaders across the state so that we are all talking about this and working collectively to come up with what are our needs and how can we talk to our legislators so that we can acquire funding and also have rules in place so that we can efficiently spend that funding on capital projects. I see Bobby and Basil sitting here. We work with them quite closely. But those are some major challenges. And the state of North Carolina is really a leader. And I would argue also in terms of air service development, I don't know how many of you are in smaller regions outside of the big city here in Raleigh, but regions, smaller regions, really need to stay in touch with their legislators. You need to have a collective voice around what you want your airport infrastructure to be, and really work on that visioning for the future. Airlines are growing. Lots of regional airports are growing right now. There is service to be had, and it's a matter of being ready to be able to handle that service.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody brave enough to raise their hand?
Just a question about roads and local use of land. How close are the roads to the use of roads in road operation? Parks, regs, city land, county land. What happens?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. I don't know that I have a perfect answer for it. The question was, what types of challenges are we running into when operating drones over public areas, such as parks and so forth? From our perspective, any time that we have flown over public areas, it was typically on contract by the public organization that needed us to fly for that type of a survey. So I think more so where the challenges we see that are less on the commercial side of drone operation and more on the consumer hobbyist side, where people are buying drones, they want to go fly them, so where do they go? They go to their park. And so this is where really nationally we see a lot of challenges coordinating between different, the FAA coordinating between the different localities, both at the state level as well as at the municipality level, where ordinances are getting passed in certain areas and trying to guide some of that direction. And so we don't really see it as much on the commercial side. We know that nationwide there have been some challenges and hurdles from more so a consumer and recreational side, although sometimes those municipality laws and regulations at state level will apply, in some cases to the drone operations. And so I know there's been a lot of collaboration out of the FAA since the FAA owns the airspace or has authority over the airspace to work with a lot of these different public organizations to help educate and coordinate when they're looking at potentially regulating the use of different ground-based areas per se.
What would you advise as far as municipality wanting to start looking at this tens of thousands of roads close to our airspace, millions? What would you, how would you go about proceeding with ordinances?
Well, I think the best thing to do would be to start getting in contact with the regional FAA offices. That's probably the best first step. Since the FAA has authority over the airspace, that poses a lot of jurisdictional challenges, I know. And so that would be, from my own personal opinion, would be to start communication with the FAA regional offices or even the FAA federally as well, because this is something that they've been looking at quite a bit of how to handle coordination, how to communicate, and then the best way to approach some of these different paths. And so that would be my advice. Is first step is talk to the FAA and see what they're doing and some of their advices.
Last round question. When you have to do an airspace like Raleigh or whatever, how do you have a dialogue with them to operate as a rule apply?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different methods that this is achieved by, and we use these all the time. So the first one is, depending on where our survey is going to be, in many cases, although it may seem close to the airport, a lot of times it may not actually be in controlled airspace. So there are, in not every case do we have to do any coordination at all, just based on the type of airspace that goes all the way to the ground for controlled airspace. Where it does have controlled airspace that does go all the way to the ground where we do need to fly. And this happens quite a bit as well. The FAA has actually launched a program called LANCE. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for. But that program allows you to essentially request permission in a gridded area based on different altitudes that airport has worked with the FAA to define. So for example, there may be a grid 1.5 miles off or within a radius of an airport that's in controlled airspace, and in controlled airspace means that they have the authority over that. then I can request permission through, in most cases, an app on my phone, and then I can get an immediate approval or denial based on the flight parameters that I put into that app. And so the FAA has been very proactive with this. We've seen lots of really good success with this application. Of course, we do get the request that we've done flights at airports, and so that takes a lot more coordination at various different levels. But for the average person who's conducting commercial operations, there's Lance provides a very easy way to get authority to fly in areas that previously, up until about a year and a half ago, was completely unobtainable.
Sorry, I'm sure Tina has an interesting perspective on this. Really quickly, in terms of future vision, though, as a potential user of this technology, what we hope and what I believe the pathway where this integration pathway will lead us, I'm not saying for the IPP, but over time, is that these vehicles will eventually be fully integrated into the U.S. airspace system. And there's lots of questions about how that's going to get done. There's questions of standardization, and there's questions of who's in charge, and there's questions of how much automation is there at play. But eventually, these are just aircrafts. And just like any other aircraft, there's going to be a set of rules that they follow. The difference is that some of these smaller aircraft don't have humans on board, so that's obviously a challenge. So that's what I think.
I was just going to mention a resource. The North Carolina Department of Transportation Division of Aviation has a lot of information specifically about these questions that you're asking. So it's a great place to go.
You're exactly right. I was going to say the same thing. Just in case anybody's not familiar with LANC, it's an acronym. It's spelled LAANC, and I wish I could remember what every part of it meant too, but it's low altitude approval, airspace authorization. There you go. Okay. So I will tell you, a year ago, to get approval to fly near an RDU or other places took weeks. It now takes less than a minute, probably. So it's automated, it's up and running. Interesting enough, during the Hurricane Florence response, they brought LANC down statewide for about a day and a half. And they weren't sure why, they just knew that they try to strip it, the FAA tries to strip everything to the ground and then build it back up, was probably the philosophy there. And once they brought it back up, NCDOT was using it to gain some of the approvals that they were flying down in the southeastern part of the state. I happened to talk to somebody in the FAA afterwards, and they said, lesson learned, number one, for us, don't bring LANC down next time. Keep it up. So, yes, sir.
So that's great when you're commercial operation and you're asking permission to get into it. But recently, a major airport in the London area was shut down by unauthorized technology. So my question is, Tina, to you, is the Airport Association or NCDOT airports group having those discussions, and what's the future plan for taking care of this issue?
So the question really is around safety with drones and commercial air service, and maybe some of the conflicts that can occur typically with recreational use. And there have not been many reported incidents, but he mentioned that there was an airport in Europe that was shut down because of recreational drone use. And it is a consideration, and we absolutely, airports are in this conversation with the FAA, with the State Division of Aviation, with all interested parties. And the good news is that there's wonderful technology moving forward, to really have a path forward for safe airspace. We will always have issues with things in our airspace that really should not be there for commercial aviation, and we have ways to monitor and go down the path of closing the airport. That's the worst case scenario, closing the airport. But we do monitor, and we can treat those recreational drone users just like we would any other item in the airspace that shouldn't be there. So I don't think that is, when I'm in conversations about this, it's not a deterrent to really being excited about drone use moving forward. It's here. It is here, and it's here in a really big way, and it's only going to get bigger. So we all have to keep talking about how to do this in the safest way possible.
I'll make a quick comment as a former airline pilot. So there's always been, there's a long history of things flying onto airports that we can't control. And if you don't believe me, ask Sullenberger. Birds are one good example. There are companies and there's an industry around bird mitigation around airports. And just like that, there will be companies and technologies that are evolving. They already have, there's an entire sub-industry around anti-drone technology that will help to mitigate that. But obviously that kind of technology to be well integrated needs standards and needs regulations and everything else. And so we're getting there. In some ways, detecting and bringing down or otherwise controlling an intrusive drone, either intentional or unintentional, might be easier than a goose. So that just depends on your perspective, right? So it's just something to think about, I guess.
Yeah. So let me also comment that for the types of operations that we're talking about, that Stuart or Tyler or others are, and there's actually one that may come online in Asheville as well, with drone use to deliver things like medical products. They are very well pre-planned routes and flight paths that stay away from commercial aviation and stay under it or stay away from it. And there's all kinds of sensors and technologies on board and on the ground to try to keep that from happening, including a technology called geofencing, which is basically meant to keep a drone flight contained within its tube or a flight, let's say. So there's a lot of engineers around the country working on these things, Precisionhawk being some of them. Are there other questions? Yes, sir.
So as you start the implementation of IGP, what are your biggest challenges? What makes you lay awake at night, and what are the things you're excited about you seeing good progression?
So I'm gonna begin the answer, and then can I hand it over to you, Tyler, and then to Stuart. So probably the single biggest thing right now is detect and avoid. As these vehicles are going to fly beyond where the pilot on the ground can see them, there's a whole issue about how do you keep from hitting other things. And Precisionhawk's worked quite a bit on this problem, so I'm going to let Tyler talk.
Yeah, detect and avoid is by far one of the hardest challenges to solve for integrating drones in the airspace. We're sharing the same exact airspace as every other airplane in the sky, and it's been set pretty straight to us that it's up to us to be able to make sure that we're avoiding those aircraft. And not only us saying that we can avoid aircraft, but we have to prove through research to the FAA that our systems and our technology will work reliably, and then be able to do that 100% of the time whenever we're flying. And so we've taken an interesting approach. There are multiple types of approaches I think that the industry can take to solve this challenge. And this is what's going to really enable us to do things such as long distance transmission line flights, package delivery. There's some other challenges there as well. Even up to integrating some of this urban air mobility of flying people in unmanned aircraft as well, because we still have to avoid other drones and aircraft when those are flying through the airspace. There are really two types of methodologies, maybe three, when looking at detect and avoid. There's what they call ground-based detect and avoid, which is using sensors on the ground. This is how we do it today with air traffic control using radars to see aircraft. There are limitations with that because we have the curvature of the earth, other obstacles that get in the way, and it's fairly expensive equipment. So that's one methodology that's being tested in various areas across the US. Precisionhawk, we believe that the detect and avoid needs to be done on board the drone itself. We've been working with a technology company to integrate a solution that the military has used for quite some time that can detect mortar fire around Humvees using acoustics. So we're actually putting a number of microphones on the drone that can hear airplanes and then through signal processing calculate exactly where that airplane is in space. And then there are also visual systems that companies are researching, radar-based systems that can go on the drone that companies are researching. And so I think there are multiple ways to look at this, but the challenge lies less in the technology of being able to do it and do it effectively, but more so in the how do we look at a system like this that is safety critical to human lives and get the FAA to accept some level of certification on software, on hardware, on process, where they will be comfortable enough to say, yes, you have proven it to us that this system is safe enough for us to be able to rely on it to keep other airplanes safe in the airspace. And so that's kind of our perspective on that.
So obviously as the potential end user and specifically to healthcare, I have a very specific answer to that. What keeps me up at night is, oh God, I'm in the hands of engineers, right? So at some point we have to put, all that stuff sounds really good to me. And so we're counting on this industry as it grows to achieve, the technologists in the industry to achieve what they promise. We need to be able to trust the technology explicitly. So when we're talking about moving human blood samples, for instance, with my institution's name potentially written on the side of it, that you know, a mishap or a crash, which will happen, hopefully never to us, but it will happen as this industry grows. Like every other transportation technology, there are accidents and crashes, but we have to sort of work with the technology providers to mitigate those risks. Operationally, there's a lot of answers to that question. There's a lot of problems we're finding that we have to solve to integrate the technology because we're shifting from essentially a courier technology on the front end where there's a human being, an extra human being in the loop, to figuring out, well, when that human being is removed eventually, then who goes and gets the sample off the drone? Where does the drone land? Is there going to be magnetic interference on the roof? What about the MRI machines? What about hazmat requirements for the box on the aircraft when there's no human holding it? There's lots of operational issues we're getting, but amazingly we're getting through them very quickly and very well because everybody, the DOT, the FAA, and all our technology partners, including Moderator, who we're working with who's providing the drones that we're using, are very much sort of understand that these have to be addressed quickly. So to me, there are challenges in terms of operational challenges, there are technology challenges that still remain. And then just broadly, and not to unpack it too much, this is sort of a trend, these kinds of technologies, especially if we start talking about larger aircraft, every sort of new technology category represents a deal with society. At some point, you have to decide a risk-benefit profile. And if we're going to accept that there are going to be accidents and there's going to be mishaps, we have to decide as a culture and as a society, what is an acceptable cost for the benefit we get from this. So I think that question will take a long time to answer, and it will also depend on what we decide we can do with it. I'm obviously sort of an apologist for the technology. I believe that in healthcare, for instance, we can not only just move lab samples quicker and easier and cheaper with this technology. That's sort of a first-tier use for us. We're getting really interested in what this technology, when it's available, can do for the way we design our healthcare system. Maybe I don't have to put a lab at this location, and maybe that means I can provide more healthcare to patients in that area. Maybe we can move healthcare to patients' homes or communities or retail pharmacies. There's lots of ways that this can sort of transform healthcare if it's seen through to its final conclusion. So those are sort of the things we think about.
He must not hate engineers too much. Maybe that's why he agrees to meet with me at 7 a.m. for coffee, because he couldn't sleep all night. That's right. Are there other questions out there? I thought I saw a few other hands go up. Yes, sir.
Drone question on companies, drone companies. What does the future look like for smaller companies? Or do you see it controlled by very few large companies, and you've got your research and development budget so you can do more, and the smaller companies will not be able to compete? How does that look in your community?
We're a little biased, I think, in what we want to see. However, we realize that especially to roll out these capabilities to very large nationwide type companies. So a good example would be a company like Verizon. Verizon is one of our investors. We do work with them. They have cell towers all across the U.S., tens of thousands of cell towers all across the U.S. I, as a larger corporation, am not going to be able to manage the logistics of hiring pilots throughout various small localities all over the place. And so what we've actually started doing is, through actually a couple of acquisitions, starting to work much more closely with smaller drone service providers. And so these are types of companies that hire pilots, they have drones, and they can go do the data collection. And so what we do is we end up working with a lot of these very small companies, which might be one person, they might be 20 people. And we work with them to train them up on the capability that we need to collect data. We provide them our software that we need them to use to collect that data. And then they become essentially our kind of representative when flying for these types of companies all across the US. And so, I think there are different aspects to that. Precisionhawk, we tend to do a lot of different things. And within a drone company, there are lots of different things that can be possible. Whether it's from flying the drone, collecting the data analytics, the software around that. Now, definitely developing software, data analytics, that's where it becomes difficult, I think, for a smaller company to enter that space because we're competing with the likes of Google and Apple for artificial intelligence engineers, and they're very expensive and very hard to attract to a smaller company. And so that's where we're, today we've realized even as a larger player in the space, we still have to rely on much smaller businesses that can achieve some of this capability for us and essentially be an extension to our company in these different, kind of disparate localities all across the U.S.
So I want to get back and ask a question. Tina, you've heard a lot, you've heard a concern about drones flying in airspace and all this. You know that this other company is about to start operations in an exciting way in Asheville. How does a regional airport keep up with this stuff? There's other technologies I know related, there's Uber and Lyft, there's all these things that are coming so fast. Can you talk a little bit about how you anticipate or how you track these things and adjust?
Well, it's all about networking. I mean, you all are here today networking with one another, learning about transportation issues, and we do the same thing. And we are doing that on a global level. So in the aviation industry, we do have innovation conferences. You go and you learn what is coming 5 years, 10 years, what is the Jetson's vision for the decades to come. And you really have to connect your organization with all the others that intertwine in aviation so that you can stay on top of those things. You mentioned that there is a potential project happening in Asheville utilizing drone technology. We will be in very close communication with the team of people who are working on that project and offering up partnership, offering up information. We are leaders in aviation in our region, and so we take that very seriously. And I think that that's the role of anyone in their industry. You really need to stay on top of it and work with all of your potential partners to move forward in the safest way possible.
Okay, we're down to about 1.5 minutes, and I'm going to be selfish and ask the last question, and Stuart, it's coming your way. So all of us will be available out in the hallway for follow-on questions. But Stuart, we've mentioned the Jetson several times. I started out mentioning it, and a few other people have mentioned it along the way. I know you have some really innovative ideas about how the medical community might use something bigger, more similar to a helicopter, to move things or people around. Would you mind talking about that for about 1.5 minutes?
Sure. So now's when it gets crazy. just kidding. So, right, so having a dual perspective in aviation and healthcare and surgery has been really interesting. So aviation has always been closely tied to healthcare, to medicine. But really, it's been a long time since that tie was transformative. Really, and most of it came from the military and helicopters and trauma systems have evolved around that technology, and that's what you see. The face of aviation and healthcare is air medical transport and helicopters. The problem with that is that it's such an expensive, intrusive resource that it's reserved for really extreme situations in healthcare. We're really not, as I mentioned before, transportation has not traditionally been on the forefront of thinking about healthcare innovation. And specifically aviation, it's just inaccessible. And that's getting worse instead of better. Air medical companies, there's been a lot of consolidation in that industry. There's basically 3 or 4 big companies that run all emergency air medical transport in the country. Some of them are privatized and their fees are going through the roof. It's not entirely their fault. They're having to cost shift because of lags in reimbursement. Simultaneously, there's overutilization of the technology, strangely enough. A lot of patients who turn out to get moved around in helicopters don't need to be. A little known fact about that is that more than half of those helicopters you see are actually flying patients from one facility to another, not going to pick up somebody on the highway. So we need this stuff. There's an intrinsic pull in aviation, in healthcare for aviation technology, but it's inaccessible. It's possible that eVTOLs and these new categories of aircraft and the technologies driving the redesign of these aircraft, appear, if what the engineers tell us is true, their mission profiles and their noise profiles will be perfectly suited to healthcare applications. And I don't mean just cannibalizing what already exists with air medical transport. I mean expanding the use cases in healthcare in the same way we're using drones. If it becomes more democratized and if it scales and if it becomes cheap enough, then we can use these vehicles more like elevators than like helicopters. And that's really exciting, and I think it's a long way away, but it's definitely coming. If you had asked me 5 years ago how close it was, I would have said 30 years. If you ask me now, I would say possibly 10 years. And I could be wrong about that. The other things about healthcare are that we've got built-in infrastructure for this technology. We have helipads everywhere. One of the big problems with urban air mobility integration for what Uber wants to do is that we have a lot, like Tina, you were discussing this before, there's a lot of work that would have to be done to integrate that technology broadly. And it will get done over time, but you can build a perfect eVTOL aircraft and still not be able to fly it because you've got to have places to land it and charge it. A lot of that infrastructure is kind of pre-built in healthcare. So there's a lot of things in healthcare that are sort of ripe for innovation, and it's possible that the bar for public acceptance is lower. The public already accepts very intrusive helicopters because they understand that they're moving to the benefit of patients and citizens. So I sort of can see a vision where healthcare could be an early area of penetration for that kind of technology.
No, it's okay. It's good. So we have run out of time. I'm getting the stop sign from the back, but I already knew it anyway. So thank you, all 3 of you. What we had up here today were 3 number ones: number 1 regional airport, number 1 technology company, number 1 innovative health network for using these new technologies. And we had them all here in the room, so we're very lucky. As I said, they'll be available out in the hallway afterwards if you want to talk to them one-on-one. Thank you very much.